which is Miss Makeya Featherstone. Mrs. Oh, she's married now, guys. She's married now. Mrs. Can't get her, Mrs. Makeya Featherstone. Okay. All right. Let me read this. Mrs. Featherstone is dedicated to helping individuals and couples navigate challenges related to trauma, relationships, anxiety, and emotional healing. She earned her Master of Social Work from the University of South Carolina and holds a BA in Psychology with a minor in Children's Advocacy Studies. Her approach blends evidence-based techniques with mindfulness, faith integration, and a focus on resilience and self-awareness. She is passionate about fostering a safe and inclusive environment. She empowers clients to reconnect with their purpose, strength, and sense of belonging. Please give her a round of applause and welcome her warmly, Mrs. Makeya Featherstone.
So my presentation is called After the Repast. When grief touches one, it touches all. And I just want to open up and just kind of have a little disclosure with you guys this morning. Actually, last year, we experienced a really big loss in our family. My sister lost her husband, and it was one of those unexpected deaths that nobody, planned for. I mean, it was kind of one of those things we really couldn't plan for because he was really young. But this presentation and what Sharita had asked me to speak on really resonates with me personally because from a family standpoint, we can't always plan and know how we're going to respond to things. And I didn't even know what my role was going to be until it happened. And so coming here today, just being able to highlight some of the things that, we go through, whether it's in our families, if you're married, what you may experience, in your relationship. I feel like it's all important because grief touches us all differently. And we don't know how we're going to respond until it happens. But we also know that it's most times after the burial, after the dinner, after everyone closes the doors and they go into their own homes. That's when you really start to know and you feel the loss and trying to figure out how do you navigate this, from an individual perspective and how do you call on your family and your loved ones. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Go to the next slide. Grief touches everyone, but no two journeys through it are the same. And I think Sharita definitely highlighted that during her presentation. But today, I like to come from the science side. So I like to teach. Because one thing I know, and one thing I know is true, is that knowledge is power. If you know something, you can do something. And so we're going to be talking about understanding grief and how it impacts our mind and our bodies. We're also going to be understanding the challenges that grief can cause in families, and also supporting children through grief. So what is grief? Understanding grief as a natural response to loss, and I think that is definitely important to highlight that it is a natural response to loss. Not saying that we're all necessarily going to experience it at the same level, for every single person, but it is a natural experience. And so grief isn't just associated with death. It can also be tied to loss, illness, divorce, abuse, or any other tough times. Because it affects us so deeply, our minds often see it as emotional trauma or PTSD. And like Sharita highlighted, it is trauma. It's not something that we can just tuck away and put behind a closed door. It impacts our minds. Grief affects many brain functions, influencing memory, empathy, y'all, I'm sorry, it's so hard for me to read, heart rate, and how we experience pain and suffering. And lastly, just to reiterate, it is a natural part of how we mourn and process the loss. And it's how our bodies try to make up and make sense of what's happening with the world around us. Next slide. So understanding grief again. So denial is common in grief. So there are 5 stages of grief. You have denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And now in all those 5 stages, it is not a linear path. Some people think that you have to move through one and then go to the next one and go to the next one. You can go from denial and go to anger. You can go to bargaining, go to acceptance. You can go from anger to depression. It doesn't matter. It's not a specific stage. And And not only that, but even if you are at a place of acceptance, you can also go back to denial and bargaining. So again, it's not something that is a linear process, but those are the general 5 stages that we experience when we have loss. So denial is common in grief, often causing delayed reactions, especially with unexpected losses, as it feels more comfortable to avoid facing reality. Everyone grieves differently. Even the same loss as individuals across their emotions differently, which is a natural part of the grieving process. Grief also has no timeline. Now, even with that, prolonged grief can become problematic. And so, but I also want you guys to know today that it has no timeline. So, if somebody comes up to you and they're asking you questions of like, why haven't you gotten over it yet? You can't. you can't give them a timeline because one, they don't understand and know the impact that loss has had on you. Nobody does. And so we cannot put a timeline to our emotions and say, okay, today is the day we're going to stop feeling sad, or today is the day we're going to stop feeling angry. But also, chronic grief can occur. When symptoms persist for long periods, complicating the grieving process and increasing vulnerability to conditions like depression and anxiety. So it can cause you to feel more depressed or even more anxious. Grief can also be delayed, and individuals who view expressing it as a weakness or feel they cannot rely on others, leading them to suppress their feelings and push through. And we can go to the next slide. So now we're going to talk about understanding grief and how it actually impacts us emotionally, physically, and mentally. So grief can feel intense because it activates the part of your brain that reacts to danger even though you're not actually in physical danger. So just like we highlighted that grief is a form of trauma, we all have a built-in alarm system in our minds. And like I was going over this with my husband, I told him, I said, now don't ask me the name of the part of the brain because I'm not good with all that stuff, but it does impact our minds. And so we either go into fight, flight, or freeze responses. So fight is, the way that it can look is like, aggression, maybe you're more argumentative. Flight is running away, so trying to get out or avoid the situation. And then freeze. Freeze is feeling stuck. Freeze is feeling like you don't have the motivation to get up and do anything. And so we all have this built-in alarm system in our mind, and it's supposed to help us. You're being chased by a dog, you want that extra adrenaline, right? In order to get to safety. But what happens is that our minds cannot tell the difference between actual threat and perceived threat. And so it's our body's way of trying to protect us. And so if you are experiencing it, it's normal, it's okay. But what we have to do is that we have to get to a place where we teach our brain to let it know that we're not in danger. But in the way that we do that is engaging in coping strategies, being able to talk to other people. Because what also happens is that when our survival instincts kick in, it shuts down our thinking brain, Because if you're walking across the street, and let's say you see a car running, you don't need your thinking brain to be like, oh, there's a car, there's the other side of the street, I need to get there. So we don't need our thinking brain. And so it will shut it down. And when we're going through our day-to-day life, that's why you sometimes hear people when they say, I'm just surviving, because you're in survival mode. You're not thinking. You're not trying to problem solve. You're just trying to get through. And that's what our brain does. Symptoms of trauma can manifest as re-experiencing the traumatic event, avoidance of reminders or triggers, hyperarousal, including heightened alertness, and negative mood or thoughts. And when we are triggered, we can't necessarily predict when we're going to be triggered. And honestly, when we was doing praise and worship, I was triggered. Because the first song that was sung was the song that was sung at my brother-in-law's funeral. Now, I've heard this song. I even played it in the car on my way to work because I love it. Trust in God, right? But sometimes it's like we can hear something over and over and over again and think that we're okay, but then it's that one moment that all of a sudden, it's like that song just hits you differently. And it brings back up those old feelings. And so we can't always prepare ourselves or predict if we're going to be triggered or not, but it is natural, it is okay if you are. Chronic stress can reduce nerve growth and memory while heightening fear to avoid survival. This stress response can negatively impact individuals and become ingrained over time. So just like what was highlighted earlier, sometimes when you're going through a loss, it's not just the loss of that person. It's the loss of security. Maybe you're even losing the loss of family. Maybe you're losing the loss of financial peace and whatever that may be. You might even be losing the loss of your home. You know, depending on how that loss impacts you. And a lot of that can add added stress, which could, again, fall into the category of chronic stress. Over time, grief can impact various cognitive functions, including memory, decision-making, attention, word fluency, and information processing speed. Sometimes you just forget things, and it's not because of your age. You know, some people be like, oh, I'm getting old, I'm just, forgetting stuff. No, you forget stuff because that's how trauma impacts our minds. And so sometimes we can't even find the words to even be able to explain ourselves. So when somebody is needing a quick response and we're trying, maybe we're just like staring at them with a blank stare, it's because our mind is not able to process and to be able to find the information that it needs. So it's not that you're just being forgetful. It's not that you're just being lazy. It's because trauma is impacting you. Next slide, please. And so we have 6 key areas of life that can be impacted by grief. These include school, work, hobbies and fun, getting along with others, family relationships, and general happiness. In my line of work, these are the areas that I tend to look at to understand what kind of functional impairment is happening to that individual or that couple or that family. And so when they come in with their symptoms, it's not just that I'm trying to understand the symptoms, but I'm trying to understand how are they impacted in the world around them. Because if you have any form of functional impairment in your life, that could be also another indicator to be able to diagnose you with prolonged grief, depression, anxiety, whatever it may be. Now, I know a lot of times, everybody responds to grief differently. Some people, instead of staying at home and, being in the bed and not having the motivation to get up, maybe you might see that they're at work all the time. They're always taking on different tasks. They're busy. And so it looks like, at face value, it's like, okay, well, you're performing well at work, you're getting along with other people, you're still engaging in hobbies, you might still have your family relationships intact, but is your general happiness there? And that's something that we don't always see. And so even though we may not see it, and even though that person may not want to recognize it, there's still functional impairment in your life. So now, emotional distance or withdrawal. Some people grieve by pulling away, which can make partners, family, or friends feel rejected or confused. Empathy and bonding opportunities. Sometimes a loss can actually bring people closer together, but that's not always a given. It all depends on the family and the situation and just the support that you may have. It may also increase conflict, difference in grieving styles. One person wants to talk, another wants space. That can create tension or misunderstandings. And also changes in roles. Family members may take on new responsibilities or shift dynamics to cope with loss, which can also be stressful. So now we're going to go to the next slide. And now we're going to talk a little bit about how this looks in relationships and couples. So grief can often lead to isolation and a focus on personal feelings, which can limit the energy available for supporting others, especially a spouse. Meeting all of your spouse's expectations may not be possible during such times. So as I talked about earlier, how it impacts our mind. Maybe prior to this loss, you were really great at multitasking. Maybe you were able to get a lot of things done. But now because of this loss, these expectations have changed. And so you're not able to complete your duties or whatever role you may have. Or maybe you might also realize the roles have to shift. And that can cause a lot of impact because, again, most times after the funeral, everybody just expects you to go back to normal. It's like, okay, we got things to do. We got a house that has to be clean. We got kids that we have to take care of. We got dinners that have to be prepared. And it's just this idea that you just have to go back and do what you were doing prior, but that's not how it is. And so a lot of times that can cause conflict in a relationship because maybe your partner, maybe you didn't hit them as much as it hit you. And so they're still looking at you to have all these things done, and it's not as simple to get those things finished. Oftentimes, couples expect each other to ease their grief, and when that doesn't happen, feelings of anger, resentment, or abandonment can arise. Now, I understand if you're married, you naturally want to go to your partner and say, hey, be my emotional support person. Who doesn't want that, right? I mean, that's kind of the whole point of why you get married, right? But in grief, we cannot assume that our partner is going to be able to meet those emotional needs. And I know sometimes it's a little difficult to see or understand because we have these high expectations for them, but it doesn't always mean that you're going to get that support in home. The idea that couples can more easily cope with the death of a loved one, especially a child, by relying on each other is not necessarily true. And sometimes it's because of our beliefs that we assume a thing to be true, we tend to operate on it. So one thing I didn't mention about how our mind works is that what we think impacts what we feel, and it impacts what we do. So if we think you are my person, you're going to help me through that, maybe we might feel peace, maybe we might feel calm. And so naturally what we're going to do is we're going to go to that person. But then if we go knock on that door and they're unavailable, now we feel anger. Now we feel left out. Now we feel betrayed. Now we feel like you don't love me anymore. And the action may be, now I'm no longer going to seek you for support in other things because you weren't able to meet that emotional need that I had. Okay, we can go to the next slide. So this is also important to understand how we grieve differently based on our gender. So women tend to grieve in what is called an intuitive fashion, while men more commonly display an instrumental approach to grief. Now this is nothing that is going to be new to y'all, because as soon as I read out the definition, y'all going to be like, exactly, I already knew it, right? So the intuitive style of grieving for women involves intense emotions where individuals experience strong feelings that reflect their inner state. Those who grieve intuitively often face confusion, difficulty concentrating, disorganization, and physical exhaustion, with their grief prominently expressed emotionally. So in other words, we tend to grieve outwardly. You know, we show our emotions, we talk more, you know, we want more companionship. And then also for men, the instrumental style of grieving, often seen in men, emphasizes cognitive processing over emotional expression. Men typically discuss their experiences analytically rather than focusing on emotions. This approach reflects a different manifestation of grief, influenced by various factors rather than indicating less pain or attachment. But that is one thing that I want to highlight. Just because they grieve differently does not mean that they're experiencing less pain or attachment. And this quote, which I feel is so important, it says, people are more likely to grieve in a manner that resembles their way of dealing with life in general. This is important because what this is saying is that even though there are specific ways, or I guess specific names for, you know, how we grieve based on our gender, it does not mean that it's that straightforward. Sometimes we have some women who maybe are not as expressive. Maybe they think more analytically. And so therefore they're going to have more of an instrumental style of grieving. There are some men who are more emotional, so they're going to have a more intuitive style of grieving. But more times than not, how you act on a regular basis is more than likely how you're going to fall into that category when you experience loss and grief. Next slide. Grieving styles can be misinterpreted as a difference in caring or attachment. One of the primary challenges for couples experiencing shared grief is a tendency to evaluate their partner's grieving process based on their own grieving styles. That's where you look at your partner and say, oh, you must not love that person enough because why are you acting like that? Or, oh my goodness, you know, maybe you feel guilty because you're so emotional, right? Like, you know, we like to assume certain things about another person, but that can be a challenge in the home. And just like I talked about the 5 stages of grief of denial, anger, acceptance, depression, and bargaining is not linear. So you are already naturally at different stages. And then now you throw that into your marriage. And then now one person is probably still at denial. You know, maybe they're thinking, this isn't happening. I would much rather take the position of, this isn't really true. They're not really gone. They're still here. While the other person is maybe at bargaining. I would do anything to get that person back. You know? And then we talk about the different ways that we grieve. And if you're bargaining and you're trying to go to your person and you're like, listen, maybe if I would have said this, maybe if I would have done this, maybe if we would have did that, they might be in a place of denial and they don't want to hear none of it. So that's going to cause tension within a home because, again, they're at different levels and at different stages. Grief can intensify relational vulnerabilities, affecting couples in several ways. So if there were already challenges prior to that loss, grief can intensify that. And I know a lot of times, especially when it comes to the loss of a child, you hear a lot of times like, maybe that couple got a divorce. And it's easy to look at like, oh, maybe that loss was so big, that's why they couldn't stay together. More often than not, it's because they probably had other relationship vulnerabilities prior to that was intensified on top of the loss of that child. And so it's hard to put something back into a box. You can't just go back to normal. You can try to suppress it and act like it's not there, but naturally you cannot go back to how things were. It may also lead to escalated four horsemen behavior, which I'm going to talk a little bit more in the next slide. But there are also communication breakdowns can create distance and misunderstanding. And without support, grief can strain attachment and trust. We can go to the next slide. So the four horsemen. If these things show up in your relationship, these are big indicators for divorce, separation, and just ultimately the downfall of your relationship. So the four horsemen, what they are is criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. Criticism in time of grief and what that can look like is maybe your partner may blame each other when overwhelmed by sadness or frustration. So an example of what that may look like is you don't even care how hard this is for me. So you're coming from a place of criticism. That's the language that you're using when you're trying to communicate. Maybe you're coming from a place of contempt. This looks like persistent emotional pain can increase irritability and resentment. So an example of what this might look like in terms of language is rolling eyes when the other person expresses sadness or frustration. We like to say like, oh, you can see my eye roll. They saw your eye roll. They saw the change in your whole demeanor, because communication is not just verbal communication, but it's also nonverbal communication. How we sit, how we engage, that lets the other person know if we're actually listening or if we're just there and we're not paying attention. And I know we all experience when you can see, like when you can be looking somebody in the eye and talking to them, and you can still tell that they're looking past you in some way. So even though we may like to fool ourselves and say like, oh, we can just put on the show, like nobody's gonna know, we know, and we can see that. Defensiveness. Now what that looks like is each partner may feel attacked or misunderstood, leading them to defend themselves rather than listen. So example is I'm doing the best I can. Stop blaming me. And stonewalling, emotional overwhelm can trigger shutdown or withdrawal. One partner may check out to cope with their own pain, which the other interprets as rejection or indifference. An example of what this looks like is sitting silently or avoiding difficult conversations about the loss. And one thing that I like to tell individuals, couples, families, like whoever I'm working with, when it comes to communication, I always like to tell them, set the person up for success. And what I mean by that is, if you need to express yourself and you see somebody over there being busy, that is not the time to go over there and say, I need to express myself to you, right? It's being able to pick the appropriate time, when they're not busy. I always say, if you don't know if that person has the ability to talk to you, ask. And asking is not saying, I feel X, Y, and Z. Asking is saying, hey, I need to talk about my feelings. Do you have time? Because if you try to do it and you don't know they have the capacity to do it, then all you're going to do is you're going to feel rejected, you're going to feel dismissed, and that's just going to add more burdens to you in terms of feeling like I don't have anywhere where I can go to express myself. And we can go to the next slide. That was already okay. So, ways that we can overcome this is seek external support if needed. Couples therapy, grief counseling, individual therapy, support groups. You need to be around people who understand. Again, maybe you do have a really strong support system, and if you do, that is awesome. Maybe you don't need to go to individual therapy or grief counseling per se. Maybe you have a circle of people that you can go to that can support to therapy, talking with someone who has the capacity to hear you, and that can be that unbiased individual that you need in order for you to be able to talk freely. Because with loss, as we know, there's so many factors that is a part of loss. Like, it's not just losing our loved one. And sometimes we feel like we can't express certain things to a member in our family or even our spouses because maybe that could be triggered for them. You know, especially if there was a lot of discord or other things that was going on, maybe we can't go to them because we already know that's going to trigger them to become angry and be reminded again of all the things that that person may have done that may have caused them hurt too. And so it's important that if you feel like you don't have that, you know, to go out and seek external support if needed. Also, establishing boundaries. Decide together how much social interaction, travel, or extended family involvement is manageable. Respect each other's limits and personal space. The way that I like to define boundaries is I like to say, or use the analogy of a fence. So you know, like when you're driving up the country roads or you're driving in the neighborhood, everybody got a different style fence. You can tell those who really want privacy. You can tell those who can care less what the backyard looks like, who's gonna get in. And then you got the country roads where it's like, you know, you're viewing the animals, and it's like, I could just hop over if I wanted to go touch the cow if I wanted to, right? So everybody has different levels. And boundaries, what is so important is that boundaries are not for the other person. It is not you going to the other person saying, hey, you hurt me, don't you ever do that again, I'm gonna block you and I'm gonna kick you out of my life, right? That is not boundaries. Boundaries is realizing the capacity that the other person has and you setting that limit in that rule. So prime example, you know, if, I'm not gonna use my husband, I'm gonna use you, that's okay. If I go up to you and I say, hey, I want your bank account information, I want your social security number, I want all of that, you look at me like you're crazy, like I'm crazy, right? Because one, I have not shown you that I have the capacity to have that information. You don't even know if I have the security to protect your information. And not only that, you don't even know me, I'm a complete stranger, so there's absolutely no trust, right? So you wouldn't come to me and share all of that information, but now if you go to a bank, you would, especially if you're applying for a loan, because they've shown you that they have a level of security, they have a level of trust, they have a level of responsibility to where you can share that information. But you also wouldn't go to your bank teller and say, I'm grieving and I don't know how to get through this. Because then they're gonna look at you like, man, I can't support you, right? So I'm gonna need you to either go talk to somebody else because it's all about the capacity and the level of responsibility that other person has. If you know that you've already tried to go talk to someone, and either they'll sit with you for 2 minutes and then somehow change the conversation and make it about them, that is not support. That is an indicator I need to maybe put a boundary here, meaning I don't need to go to them if I have a deep emotional need that I need to talk about. It's not kicking somebody out your life. It's just knowing who to go to and what to go to them for. Then lastly, practice self-care individually and together. Physical care, you know, getting enough sleep, nutrition, exercise. Emotional care, journaling, prayer, meditation, quiet reflection. Shared care, gentle activities that promote connection and calm. And now we're going to go to and talk about grief and families. So again, grief can either draw families close together, and sometimes it can pull them apart. Just in when I was putting together this presentation, and it's actually ironic, I should say, I think maybe 2 or 3 weeks after Sharita asked me, my sister-in-law recently lost her dad. And so our family was hit again with another loss. And last week, in trying to prepare this, and then my parents decided they wanted to travel, and I'm like, every time y'all travel, I was like, something is always going on, like y'all need to just stay home, right? And so I had to end up going home, and I had to help out with my grandma and my siblings and take care of all of our animals that we now have. And it was a lot. You know, I was tired. You know, I called my husband, and I'm like, I'm just so ready to get in my bed. Like, I don't want to do anything else. And then I remember I had this presentation I had to do, and I'm like, it's never ending. Like, I'm tired. You know, it's a lot. And even when my sister lost her husband, you know, the roles have to change because now there is a space where someone was supposed to be and they're not there anymore. And it's how do you fill that space when you know you can never be that individual? have, you know, a different like sleep schedule. So we would all go over to her house and pick a night and spend a night with her. And I don't have kids. She has 2 young children. So I got no sleep. You know, that's something that's different for me to have to deal with. And then it's a laughing joke now, but she had this air mattress. And I used to think, I was like, oh my gosh, maybe I'm not blowing it up right, because in the morning I would be on the floor. And I'm just sitting here like, oh my gosh, and I'm still working a full-time job, and I'm like, I'm getting no sleep at all. And I know one morning I woke up and I was like, sister, I was like, I love you so much. I said, well, please, for the love of God, get some new pillows, get something. I was like, I need some sense of comfort. And but she went and got those pillows though, so I was like, thank you for doing that. But it can either bring you close together or far apart. And the other thing is, like, you know, even in our time of doing that, you know, I have family, like we have family that live 10, 15 minutes, and do you think they came to the house? No. You know, and I was sad, and it was disheartening, because in times like this, you have this expectation that let's put differences aside, like let's come outside of ourselves. And they couldn't even do that. They came to the funeral, but again, the funeral is not support. You know, it's after you bury the person, after you have the meal, that's where the support really kicks in.
That's right.
And so when you're grieving, again, you tend to be in a state of chaos. So it may challenge your beliefs. You know, I'm sure every person in here is very strong in their faith, but let's not fool ourselves. Sometimes when things happen unexpectedly, we're gonna ask God why. I know I can read in your word, and you tell us that, you know, you're close to us, that, you know, we may not always understand, but to have faith. Sometimes you don't realize that you're challenged on what faith actually looks like until there's literally nothing that you can see moving forward. You know, and so it can challenge your beliefs, but it doesn't mean that you're weak. It doesn't mean that you're not faithful. But we're human, and God knows that we're human. Disrupt your routine. Kind of how I talk about, you know, sleeping and not being in my home. It can throw your life in turmoil. Maybe you don't know what the next day is going to look like. You know, you're trying to plan maybe 2 or 3 weeks out, and you can't even do that because nothing makes sense right now. And so you're trying to figure everything out. You can't predict how you will respond when someone you love dies. Reactions to loss depend on many factors, such as how the person died. Sometimes it could be an expected loss. You know, maybe you saw it coming. Or it could be unexpected. And not only that, but if it's unexpected, how? Was it tragic? That has a whole other layer to it. If you had other losses and how you dealt with them, you know, sometimes like when we are on social media and we see a celebrity pass away, you know, the running thing is like, oh, well, they die in threes, right? That happens even in our families. They go in threes or in numbers. The year that I lost my brother-in-law, my sister-in-law, she lost her brother. And then we had a church member who lost her baby. And so it was just loss after loss after loss, and that's not even including the losses that we had the years prior to that. And so all of that can have an impact on you in terms of how you grieve. And also the kind of relationship that you have with the person. Was it a close relationship? Was it a strained relationship? You know, what was that relationship like? And that can impact how you respond in that moment. And I would also like to highlight too that, you know, every loss is different. You know, even when it came to my brother-in-law passing, that was the first time that I truly felt like I experienced grief. You know, of course, in other losses I felt sad, and you know, and I didn't necessarily know, like, you know, what life was going to be without him. But grief has a different feel to it. And it's something that you can't always put into words. And so it's important to recognize that. Because again, your relationship to that person may be different from someone else in your family or someone else in your home. And so if you're not seeing that it looks the same, it's probably because it's not the same. It doesn't make their love for them any less. It just means that the way that they view it is differently. Prime example, like my mom, she had a best friend. She died a few years back, and you know, this person was always at functionings, and you know, anytime she gave it, she also lived in a different state, so I didn't see her all the time. And so when the news came that she had passed away, in that moment, it just almost felt like she was on vacation because I already didn't see her. You know, so I was able to just kind of tuck it away in my mind of like, oh, she's just on vacation, like she's good. But then I remember going to the actual funeral because I ended up going with my mom, and I was calm. I was fine, when we went to go view the body, like everything was good. And so my mom was like, can you just read this scripture today at the funeral? I was like, yeah, I can do it. Y'all, I got up there the day of the funeral, and I couldn't even get the words out. My mom was looking at me like, what happened? And I'm like, I don't know. It just hit me out of nowhere. I have no idea. But still in all, like even after that moment, I was still able to just kind of sort of say, like, she's on vacation. But when it came to my brother-in-law, it didn't feel like he was on vacation. It truly felt like it was a loss. And also knowing that it's very common for grieving people to move between grieving and coping. I know sometimes that can make things look a little weird, right? Like where it's like 1 minute you're over here talking about like, you're depressed, you can't get out of bed, and then the next time I look at you at the store and you're running errands, like which one is it, right? And so we can get frustrated because it's like, which one do I believe? Do I believe that you're really grieving and sad? Or are you, just kind of maybe putting on a show? It is normal for people to go back and forth and move between grieving and coping. When someone dies, it occurs with the context of existing family relationships, which may include long-standing tension and disputes. Such issues are likely to intensify due to feelings of loss and practical matters that arise during bereavement. And I know some people can look at it and just say, why do we want to continue to hold a grudge, or why are we still operating in unforgiveness when this person has passed? But not everybody sees it that way. Sometimes it could also be a result of, I didn't get to even tell that person how I felt. And sometimes holding on to anger could be their way of trying to understand, because it's like their anger keeps them close to the person that is lost. So it's important that we don't look at other people and judge them based on how they're grieving. If you don't feel comfortable, set a boundary. You don't have to kick them out your life, but just set a boundary, because you're realizing maybe I can't go to you, or maybe I can't allow you into my inner circle. And remember how we talked about fences? It's not strangers that open up the fence. It's you that opens up the fence. So if you don't feel like they need to be in your immediate circle, then just close the gate. And you kind of sort of deal with them how you feel is appropriate, but you don't have to keep them out of your life. As a parent, it's natural to want to shield your child from the pain of a family death. However, the caution that this instinct doesn't hinder their grieving process. Children, like adults, may feel chaos and loneliness after loss, and their understanding of death's finality varies with age and development. And I know it's so easy, to try to protect them, right? Like, we don't want to tell them everything that's going on. Like, we want to keep their innocence, because sometimes, depending on how the loss happens, you feel like their innocence could be taken away. But it's important that we try our best to explain it to them in a child-friendly term. And if I'm being honest, I can't even tell you what that is, because even when it came to my nieces, it's like, as adults, we don't even understand this. We get through it. We have other supports, we can manage things, but we sometimes can't even put words to it. So how do you tell it to a child? And so sometimes it takes you sitting with yourself and asking, like, okay, what is it that I want to say? Lean on someone that you can trust and support, and just say, hey, do you think that this is appropriate? Do you approve of this? Especially like if you're in a home together, like let's say, husband and wife, maybe you lost a child, so they're grieving the loss of their sibling. This is a prime moment where instead of trying to take over, say, you know what, this could be a bonding moment for me and my partner. Let us talk to each other and let us come up with a game plan of how we're going to express this to the children who are still here, right? But then also it's important to realize that children are very intuitive. That's why sometimes kids come to you and ask you 50 million questions, and it's like, go to the other room because you're listening too much, right? Like, you read it by mouth, you ain't supposed to know all this information. Children, no. Even when it came to my niece, the night that we lost her dad, I can still even visually tell you guys, where I was standing when we got the news. And I remember, my sister got her in therapy, and so my sister was sharing with me just her process, and she was like, Makeya, she was like, can you believe, her name is Iris, she was like, can you believe Iris remember this? And I was like, what did she remember? She was like, the night that he wasn't answering, and we had to get in the car and try to find him, she was like, she remembers that. And in that moment, I was like, I totally forgot that even happened. And so we gotta realize that children, even in their own space, they have memories of what that looks like. You may not think that they heard you crying. You may not think that they heard you screaming. They may not think that you heard, yelling or running out the house, whatever it is, but they know. And so it's important that you talk to them and you explain things to them, but also if they need support, to get them that support. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in the next few slides. But I also want to touch on how grief can impact parenting and sibling relationships. So experiencing a loss can disrupt routines, emotional support, and family roles. Children grieve differently than adults, often exhibiting behavioral issues. And I know that can sometimes be shocking. It's not abnormal for after a big loss and then you send them back to school and now all of a sudden you're getting call after call after call saying you gotta come pick up your child, right? Because a lot of times they show their grief through behavioral issues. They may express emotions through actions rather than words. And you have to think about it from a child's perspective. Most times, when we teach them about feelings, it's the four generic ones, like happy, sad, angry, and afraid, right? But when you're grieving, that is beyond sadness. And they themselves don't even understand that. Because our emotions are on the spectrum. Even though it may be in the same category, but it's a spectrum. And so the way that they express themselves is through actions and behaviors. Parents may struggle with their own grief while trying to maintain stability for children, potentially affecting parenting styles. So the different kinds of ways that we parent, you have the passive parenting style, which is, that saying where it's like, oh, you're trying to be your child's friend, that's a passive parenting style. And then you have the authoritarian, which is more like a dictator. Sorry, y'all, my breakfast has come back up. It's like a dictator. And that's where, you're trying to control everything, or you're putting these unrealistic expectations, and you have these really strict rules. And then you have authoritative, where you have rules and boundaries, but there's still that sense of freedom that as they age, as they show a different level of trust, you give them a little bit more freedom based off of that. But in times of grief, maybe you were authoritative, right? You had everything figured out. You were really good, easy going. You had your structure. But at the time of loss, now maybe you can't stand the screaming and the yelling. So you become authoritarian. Now it's shut it down. No more playtime. Go to your room. These are the expectations. Maybe the expectations get stricter. Or maybe you kind of take more of the passive route, where it's like you don't have the energy in you to correct anything. So let me just let you go do whatever's going to help you to be quiet and get out of my face, because right now I'm trying to deal with my own emotions and I can't deal with you, right? And so it can change your parenting style. Children may have to process their own grief, but also their parents' grief, which can be a heavy emotional burden. Again, children see, and they feel, and they know everything, and they know things that you probably don't even think that they know. And they're also watching you grieve, and that's why it's important. I tell my parents and couples all the time, even when I'm seeing couples and, we're trying to help them, not in light of grief, but maybe it's just communication issues, I'm like, your kids are hearing that. It's teaching them something, and when you think about a child, as a parent, you are their first everything. They don't know what the world looks like only based off of what you tell them the world looks like. So you are their first example at life, how to communicate, how to handle their emotions, how to do certain things, how to behave. And when you're also grieving yourself and maybe, you're having a hard time handling the loss, or maybe you're feeling like my child can't see me cry. It's not that they can't see you cry, it's more so of explaining what is going on. If you're cooking a meal and you find yourself crying over the pot of spaghetti, when your child is sitting at the table and you have them coloring and doing homework, and they're looking at you, it's okay to look at them and say, hey, mommy is just sad because I was thinking about such and such, but I'm okay, and this is what I'm going to do to help myself feel better. I'm ready for dinner, and maybe I might get me a nice cold Dr. Pepper because, that's what I really want. You're teaching them coping skills without it being directly. And so it's okay to let them know why you're crying. It's okay to, even if you have an angry outburst, to let them know, hey, I understand this may have scared you, and it may have freaked you out. Mommy didn't know, or daddy didn't know how to deal with this emotion, and it came out this way. It wasn't okay, right? It's explained to them like this is not the way that we want to address our feelings, and I'm sorry that it scared you if it did, but this is what I was feeling, but this is what I'm going to do now moving forward to help them with those emotions. And so you're teaching them coping skills, and you're using So ways to navigate challenges within the family unit is having open communication. Despite the difficulty, open communication and trust are crucial for helping the family navigate this challenging time. Have and maintain routines when possible. Stability helps children. They really thrive off of predictability. They like to know, hey, if this is the time that we're going to wake up in the morning. Now, I'm not saying that they're going to always do it, okay? But they do enjoy predictability and that, having that sense of structure. They have something to look forward to. When they come home, are they going to know that it's going to be homework time, meal time? Or when they come home, is it always going to be chaos? That cause, like if it's always chaos and they can't tell, their left from their right, then that's also going to add to those behavioral responses that you're trying to eliminate. So predictability is really great for children as well as the adults. Setting healthy boundaries. Define what supports you can realistically offer. Respect when family members need space or privacy. Communicate limits calmly but clearly. And so, even with that within your home, I know sometimes it's not okay to go to your room and slam the door. Don't focus on the behavior. Recognize in that moment, they may need time away. They need a moment to cool down. Let them cool down. Let them regulate themselves. Then you can walk in and say, hey, what is going on? They can tell you, I was really upset, because of such and such. Talk to them. And then it's also okay to say, hey, I'm glad you told me how you're feeling. However, the next time you feel this way, do X, Y, and Z. Because slamming the door is not something that, we're going to have in the house. You can correct them, but it's all about how you correct them. And one thing I didn't highlight, which is just not coming to me, so I apologize, but back when I was talking about couples and communication, effective ways of communicating is using I feel statements. I feel statements is not I feel you did X, Y, and Z. That's not I feel statements. Just because we put I feel in front of what we're going to say, that's not I feel statements. I feel statements is highlighting what is the emotion that you're having. So I feel sad. I feel frustrated. I feel confused. What is that emotion? Because why? Can you explain why you feel that way? One thing I like to kind of add on to that is to also speak from your perspective of what you understand from the other person. If you have your partner or even if it's your child, and you say, hey, I feel mad that, that when I asked you to do something and you yelled at me. I understand maybe you're frustrated right now. But it's really important to me that we don't raise our voices in the house and that we don't yell. And so moving forward, if you feel like maybe I interrupted your time, it's okay to tell me that I interrupted your time and I will honor that, right? So it's just all in how you communicate it and how in the language that we use. But also with navigating challenges for families is seeking external support, trauma-based services. So it's important, especially for children, highlighting, because again, grief is trauma for them. So making sure that you're going to a trauma-based provider, because, and I'm not saying that individual therapy alone is not good, but you also want someone who understands how trauma impacts their body and their brain. Because again, you're more than likely seeing a lot of behavior problems. So they're going to be able to help that child process the loss, process their emotions, but also help them to create their behaviors. And the way that they do that is getting them to use their brain to saying, okay, how are you connecting this in your mind? How are you seeing it from your viewpoint, and how can we correct that? And again, like I said, I'm not saying that, just individual therapy alone won't help, won't get you guys there, but it is good to highlight, grief and that you're looking for trauma-based services, or even play therapy, depending on their age. Maybe they're not old enough to be able to talk things through, but they can do play therapy, which is still another way of being able to help them process the losses, just doing it in play, and it's not as difficult for them to be able to process that. But then also encourage shared healing activities. So it's okay to have moments where you say, how about we as a family reflect on the loss? If you need to go visit the gravesite, it's okay. You'll be surprised how much kids can really handle. They're very resilient, but their resiliency really depends on their parent and how much their parents support them through that. So having shared activities, letting them draw it out if they want to, playing games, whatever it may be, but having those shared healing activities and help So navigating challenges within a family unit, acknowledge the loss. Again, kids feel it, they understand it. The best you can do is acknowledge that the loss has happened. Allow yourself and your partner or family to recognize the absence of your loved one. Set realistic expectations. Don't feel obligated to make it perfect. Accept that emotions may be intense or unpredictable. Again, don't just set your other people up for success, but set yourself up for success. We have to have a certain level of self-awareness and insight to be able to say, I can't say yes to this because I know that emotionally I'm not ready for that. We gotta set boundaries. We gotta learn how to start saying no. That needs to be our favorite word is no. We tell it to our kids all the time, right? Like, no, don't do that, no, don't do that. But we gotta also learn the word no too. And it's not that you're being mean, it's not that you're being rude, it's just you're simply communicating, I don't have the capacity. And I need more time for myself, I need more time for my family, I need to be able to bring us back together. And so maybe you're, we're really involved in your community, or maybe you're really involved in your church, If you have an understanding pastor and you're the type of person they're always calling on because they know you can get things done and you feel like I'm not the person to get things done in this season, communicate that. Say, hey, I'm not leaving, I don't want to leave my role. I still want you to call me in the future, but right now, can you ask somebody else? Right now, can you go to somebody else because I can't do that. Or if you don't want to give up the role completely, can I also have a partner? Someone who can share the responsibilities with me, and I need someone who's going to step up to the plate because I cannot handle this task alone. Creating new or adopted traditions include rituals that bring comfort, like lighting a candle, cooking a favorite meal, storytelling. Adapt existing traditions to reflect the current family reality. Just because there's a loss doesn't necessarily mean that things have to be exactly the same. It can't be exactly the same. As we're getting ready to come into holiday seasons, maybe holiday after holiday you keep trying to do everything the same way because maybe that's your way of saying, okay, this is my remembrance of the person that I lost. But the reality is that physically they're not here. And you got to think about everybody else that's around you as well. How do they want to enjoy the holiday? How do they want to spend it? How can you guys create new traditions without necessarily kicking out, the old traditions that was specific to the person that you lost? It's just a matter of adapting, but you can still have that same shared family time. It's just doing it differently and looking at it from a different perspective. Maintain communication. I know I speak a lot about communication, but communication is key. Communication is what keeps the world going. It's what keeps families together. And what is, it's a thing that we use every single day, whether we're at home or we're out in public. So communication is key. Check in on each other's emotional needs. Discuss triggers and plan coping strategies in advance. I like to say to all my clients, be proactive, not reactive. Don't keep telling yourself you think you're going to be able to handle something and you've already been shown that you can't handle it. Be proactive. Be real and honest with yourself because that is the only way that you're going to be able to address or go into the new holiday season or even just, again, life, the next part of life in a much better and healthier state. So one thing that I did not have on here that I just wanted to highlight, so I'm going to teach y'all for just a little minute. I'm not going to preach, I'm just going to teach a little bit. But I want to highlight the story of Martha and Mary. And now, if anybody is a Martha, I'm a Martha. That's how I identify myself. I'm not going to lie to y'all. A lot of times when I would hear the story about Martha, I would kind of cringe because I'm just like, how do I become a Mary? Like, I don't know. It doesn't come easy. Like, I'm the one that's always like, making sure everything is happening, making sure everybody else is okay. A lot of times I have delayed reactions because I got to make sure that everybody else is good before I, check on myself. But when we hear about Martha and Mary, Martha is the busybody, right? Martha is the controlling one. Martha is the one who doesn't know how to sit down. And then we got little Miss Mary, who just loves how to sit at Jesus' feet. She could be the least responsible person, but somehow she still knows how to do the right thing at the right time, right? So it's like, how do we become a Mary, right? And so in Luke 10 through 41, 41 through 42, we see Martha. She is opening up her home to Jesus. At this time, we automatically know, Martha didn't create, come into these behaviors overnight. inviting Jesus into her home. And I'm sure that just like the community around them, everybody's hearing about this man who has this level of authority, right? So I'm inviting him into my home. I'm inviting a man of authority into my home, right? I'm gonna cook, I'm gonna clean, I'm gonna make sure everything is nice. And then I got my sister Mary. Finally, somebody with authority can see it the way I see it, and they can call her out on her stuff, right? So it's like Martha's in the kitchen, you know, you got Jesus and his disciples, and Mary sitting at the feet of Jesus, listening to everything. And here comes Martha. Jesus, tell my sister to help me. You don't see all these things I got going on? And Jesus looks at Martha and he says, Martha, you're worried about a lot. And we can look at that scripture and we can say, here it goes again. Martha being corrected, Martha being rebuked, Martha, nobody wants to Martha, Martha always being called out, right? And then it just ends. And that's why I never really like the scripture, because I'm like, it just ends there. And I'm like, you don't give us no direction, right? All you tell us is to be at Jesus' feet, but it's like, how do you do that? And so, what I've learned, and this is something that God has taught me, is that when you look at those scriptures again, and understand it, is that Jesus couldn't rebuke Mary, because technically, Mary was doing the right thing. Even in how she was doing things, she was able to go sit at Jesus' feet. So he had to say, Martha, I hear you. But I also can't just tell Mary to get up, because this is why I'm here. This is why I came. And what I love is that the next time we hear about Martha and Mary is at the time of their brother's death. Okay? Y'all follow me? So, when you go to John, in chapter 11, they call out to Jesus and they tell him about their brother being sick. You know, Jesus delays his time. He doesn't show up until after 4 days. And at this time, what was custom was that, in time of mourning, everybody's coming over to the house, consoling them. So Mary and Martha more than likely, kind of shut up in the house at that time. But when Martha heard that Jesus was there, she left. And she said, peace out, I'm going to see Jesus, right? And so what I love is I was like, okay, God, I was like, well, but what does this mean? And he taught me, he said, look at Martha differently. And I'm going to tell y'all to be a Martha, and I'm going to explain why. Because when we first hear about her, it's easy to look at it and say, God rebuked her, or Jesus rebuked her. She was called out, finally put in her place, right? But if you keep reading John, after Martha has her encounter with Jesus, she runs back home and she tells Mary, she says, Mary, the teacher has come. And it's important to highlight how she labels Jesus. And she labels him as a teacher. And as we know, a teacher teaches, right? They instruct, they give guidance. So you're not going to view someone as a teacher unless you feel like they've given you guidance in life. The last time we hear about Martha and Mary is when Martha invited Jesus into the home. Martha goes to Jesus and say, hey, tell my sister to help me. And we hear it as a rebuke. Martha, you're worried about too much. But really, Jesus gave her permission to say, Martha, you ain't got to worry about all that stuff anymore. I don't know what maybe in life has taught you. Maybe it was put on you at a young age that you have to be the responsible one. Maybe life taught you that you're not allowed to put your feelings first because you got to take care of your siblings. We don't hear anything about Martha's parents. What happened to them? Did they pass? Did the roles and the burdens that they fall on her because she was the oldest? And then, of course, Lazarus being the man, you know how society treated men. So, really and truly, it was Martha and Mary that was trying to figure that thing out. But he taught her a lesson. He told her, I can't correct your sister because she's doing what's right, but I'm also going to give you permission that you can do the same thing. And it was at the time of loss that it wasn't Mary who got up off the floor from weeping and crying. It was Martha that when she heard Jesus came, she ran to him. And she was able to go back to her sister and say, the teacher is coming. So, today, God is giving y'all permission. If you're Martha, and you feel like the weight has been on your shoulders, and you feel like you're the only one in your family that has had to carry the burden of the loss. Maybe you're, taking in people, maybe depending on who the person was that past, maybe they had children and you're now assisting with the care of them. And it feels like if you don't do it, no one else will. But you have to tend to your feelings too. And Jesus is going to give you permission. He's giving you permission to tend to that while also tending to the other responsibilities that you have. Amen? Amen.
Let's give Minister Mrs. Makeya Featherstone. That was good. That was good. That was good. And we thank you for what you shared and getting to the dynamics of how grief impacts the family and children, because we focus a lot on the individual, but we don't focus on how the whole unit is impacted. And man, that was good. That made me a mama. That was good. That was good. That was good. So we're going to have Mrs. Featherstone back to do some further teaching. Okay, so I see that you guys have your pictures and you're ready to share and talk about your loved ones. And so what we're going to do is we're about to transition to a time of sharing. And we're also getting the food ready, so you guys hang tight. We still have some snacks. If we could, I know you have sat down, you're already comfortable, but because we're sharing and because it could be intense, I want to decrease the size of your group so everybody can get a chance to share. So if you could, do I do that? So I do want to acknowledge Minister Yvette Greer. She's from the church that I go to at New Zion. And she came, she supported me coming down the road, and she wanted to make sure I go back home and not stay here. So she got my back. All right, so if I could get you guys to transition, and if we could get 3 people per table. 3 people per table. Be willing to move. Be willing to